Hey guys, what's up? I'm Hi, and this is going to be just a quick follow-up video to that Mill Prison deck I debuted in the last video. In this video, we're going to look at best of three, and I'm going to share my thoughts on what I view as a kind of good sideboard plan and strategy. Now, rather than list every single possible deck in Historic and show you what cards I would board out exactly, what cards I would board in. I'm not going to do that just because there's so many different types of decks in Historic, and even some of the similar archetypes have different nuances and different amounts of cards. So rather than like sideboarding to some strict, rigid template where you're boarding out the same three cards and bringing in the same three cards every time for every matchup, I tend to kind of play more on the fly and what I've observed my opponent to play, so I can kind of craft a tailored strategy or boarding strategy for what I'm playing against. So without further ado, let's dive in. And also, so like I was saying, rather than go through every deck, we're going to talk about just the main three types of decks you're going to play. Of course, that'd be control, aggro, and combo decks. So we'll cover those in their general aspects and go from there. But the first thing you're going to observe, I put my sideboard to the right of the lands here. So here's the familiar deck from the last video. And one thing you may notice is Kahira is now gone. The companion I've just omitted. Most matchups is just not even really relevant, and I believe it's more important to just have that extra 15th slot rather than having Kahira floating around the sideboard and kind of gunking things up there. So anyways, to the right of the lands here is the sideboard. We've got 4 Rune Crabs, 4 Maddening Cacophonies, 4 Fateful Absence, and 3 Supreme Verdicts. Now, we'll talk about control first, because the control matchups, I believe we can bring in the most amount of sideboard cards and enhance our deck the furthest. So I don't necessarily mind the matchups. So when we're talking about control, some examples, of course, blue-white control we're all familiar with. Face it on the ladder from time to time. It's just pure cancer, really annoying to play against. But we've got a good strategy against them. Other control decks, maybe big colorless decks that run Ugin, even big green control decks now, they can go over the top. So decks like that is what we're talking about when we say a control deck. So right off the bat, let's identify some of the cards we don't need against control. Most of the times 9 lives is pretty much useless against control. But it's even worse than that, because it's not only just useless, it becomes a liability. I mean, you've probably had this happen if you've tried this deck before, or any other 9 lives prison decks. Obviously it absolutely sucks to give your opponent a win condition and lose this card to some sort of sweeping enchantment removal that your opponent has, and you just lose on the spot. So most often against like white-blue control, we got to look out for things like Farewell. Also against big green decks, Back to Nature can kill us by sweeping all of our enchantments, killing our 9 lives. And also in like big colorless decks, Ugin, the Planeswalker, of course, can sweep everything, kill 9 lives, and in the process kill us. So we want to get rid of these useless cards, and of course especially 9 lives, because like I said, it's just a liability. So against control, we can actually have the potential to bring in all of these cards, but most importantly, the most important cards are going to be Rune Crab and Maddening Cacophony, as well as some of the Fateful Absences. Supreme Verdict, not so much. We might bring in 1 or 2 copies, depending on if we can find enough useless cards to bring out, depending on the matchup. But generally speaking, let's say like white-blue control, for example, we're going to board out all the 9 lives, all 4 Solemnities, because they're not very useful anymore with 9 lives, and most of the time they're not going to hit or hinder any cards our opponents are playing. So right off the bat, we can bring these in. What we want to do is just go all in mill, so we can mill our opponent as fast as possible. Another good thing to do, after our opponent has observed our deck in game 1, they may see that we didn't run any creatures, so Rune Crab can really shine in those instances where we bring it in game 2. If you can get that out on turn 1, your opponent is instinctually, and probably correctly, they're going to bring out, or they're going to board out rather, a lot of their creature removal, since they saw that you have no creatures. So now Rune Crab can come in and really shine, and if this stays out for a few turns, it can really mill a lot of cards for one blue. Is very efficient at milling our opponent quickly. So we're going to board out 9 Lives Solemnity, and oftentimes we will board out Leyline of Sanctity as well, as this just doesn't really do anything against most control decks. We just don't need it. So like these 12 cards off the bat are usually pretty useless. So that means we can bring in all the Ruin Crabs for additional mill, all the Maddening Cacophonies for additional mill power, and furthermore, we can even bring in some Fateful Absences. Now this is a good versatile card, obviously, but in a matchup against control, being able to kill a creature or a planeswalker is important. There's a lot of powerful planeswalkers that we just need to remove, like Teferi. We don't want that to be on the board for too long and have it snowball out of control and have our opponent just get a big card advantage over us. So we need to kill things like that on the spot. Obviously, it's not that efficient to let our opponent cast a planeswalker, maybe draw a card, do something, and then we kill it. And we also give them another clue token to potentially draw another card. But this is a sacrifice we're absolutely willing to take because we have to remove these important cards from the battlefield. And moreover, giving our opponent a clue token is kind of interesting in this mill strategy because it's not necessarily the worst drawback in the world. You know, our opponent still has to spend a little bit of time and resources just to get that card. And again, we're a mill deck, so them drawing one card is just one less card we have to mill from their deck. So it's not the worst thing in the world. And against control, you're not going to be pressured to die very quickly. So you have time to just do this and give your opponent an extra card while removing a really potent threat like a Teferi. Now, moreover, so these are our main 3 cards we're going to bring in. Like I said, Supreme Verdict, not really going to make much of a showing against control. However, there are times where we might bring it in where there are some other cards that we can bring in that may not be very useful against control, such as Temporary Lockdown. This might come out as it's just not going to hit much against our most opponents running a control deck. So in those instances, you know, maybe you might cherry pick one of these and get in, you know, 1 or 2 Supreme Verdicts just to clear out like Shark tokens. The fact that it can't be countered is kind of nice. You know, we still have to have some defenses against control because they are gonna try to kill us with some way or another. But generally, that's really just the general strategy against control is just boarding out the useless cards and the liability cards like 9 Lives and just going all in mill on them. So it's pretty straightforward, and I enjoy the matchup because against these slower decks, milling them is just a really efficient way to win because they're just going to have a ton of defensive cards that are just useless against us, and most decks aren't really prepared to handle a mill strategy just because this is such an unorthodox strategy. It's not really that popular, you know, kind of fringe, maybe lower leagues, but in Mythic, especially, I don't really see any mill decks at all. Most of the time, very, very small amount of them anyways. So I do like the matchup. Moving on to aggro decks, like Wizards, of course, probably the most representative of the fast aggro decks right now. It's super powerful, so potent. Against the deck, heavy aggro decks like Wizards, rather, my general strategy is we're going to lessen the amount of mill cards a little bit because we just don't need that much mill against them. I mean, ultimately, it is going to be our win condition, of course, but we just need to ramp up our defenses a little bit. So against something like Wizards, Mesmeric Orb doesn't feel very important or good to me. It doesn't enhance your defense at all early, and even worse, you know, it could spill over cards into their graveyard, and now they're using an Arcanist or something else to get value that you just gave them. So this isn't something I really feel you really want against aggro, especially if they're utilizing their graveyard. Same with you know, Rest in Peace, depending on the type of aggro deck you're against. If they're not really using their graveyard too much, there's another card you can consider taking out. So against aggro, like Wizards, for example, what we're looking to bring in would be, of course, the Fateful Absences, just to have some turn 2 instant creature removal, very important because their deck is so explosive. They can hit you with huge haste creatures on turn 2. So to be able to have a chance to actually kill those things before we can get 9 lives is very important. So I'd certainly consider taking out all the orbs, getting in 4 absences, faithful absences, and also we want more creature removal so the Supreme Verdicts can come in. We can remove, like I was saying, Rest in Peace depending on the matchup. Leyline of Sanctity against Wizards, that would not come out if they've got a lot of burn. We want to keep this, of course. Also against black decks with Discard and Thoughtseize and cards like that. We're going to want to keep Leyline of Sanctity. But if you're up against something like a green aggro, where they're not really targeting you directly, certainly this could come out. And that's also an important thing to note. Like I said, there's so much nuance. Say you're up against a green aggro, they might have like something like Back to Nature as well. That's where the matchup gets a lot more tricky, because if we've seen some ways that they can actually damage us and sweep our enchantments in game 2, well, then we have to pivot, and we can no longer really rely on the 9 life strategy. It becomes a little bit too dangerous because we can't always win fast enough. We don't want to give them too many turns to find a sweeper. So in those instances, Supreme Verdict and just creature removal and then keep milling them is going to be kind of the strategy. But most of the times, hopefully they're not going to have an out to 9 lives and we can keep this in. Certainly against Wizards, it's going to stay in and be one of our most important cards. But like I was saying, we're going to lessen the amount of mill cards. So Mesmeric Orbs coming out to make room for some of the verdicts. Other things you can consider would be Ashiok coming out, just because most of the time it's going to die too quickly and it's not going to be able to generate a lot of value. Teferi's Tutelage is slower. However, the fact that you do get to draw a card and then discard a card can be a little bit important to help you find 9 lives, in a pinch, to find it on turn 3 and get it out on turn 4. Hopefully that's fast enough. Hopefully you just had it naturally on turn 3, of course. But Teferi's Tutelage can be okay just for that ability to draw the card. Tasha's Hideous Laughter can deck an incredible amount of cards. So it really doesn't take much to mill Wizards because their deck is so low casting cost with Tasha's Hideous Laughter. So I'd keep this in most of the times. And like I said, the cards I'm looking to take out probably against Wizards would be most of the time Ashiok, sometimes the Rest in Peace, and the Mesmeric Orbs especially, to just make room for these more defensive cards. Also, the Rune Crabs can make an appearance. It's not spectacular against Wizards since they have so many flyers. They're just going to fly over it. It can chump block, some ground creatures, but oftentimes they're getting trample, so it can slow them down a little bit. You might consider removing, some of these slower cards like Pull of the Mist Moon, but you wouldn't remove Temporary Lockdown. That's great in the matchup. But that's the general plan here is just, again, lessening the amount of mill a little bit, getting in some more defenses depending on what your opponent's running. And lastly, we can just cover quickly the combo decks. This is matchups where I feel you're going to be boarded in the least amount of cards, just because in all my experience in a lot of the best of 1 games, and how I was able to climb the ladder so quickly was the emergence of all these new artifact combo decks and a lot of these, Trap Finder decks where they're targeting you directly to win, whether it's a Tendrils of Agony or maybe it's a Goblin Charbelcher deck and they need to target you directly. We're already equipped pretty well against these decks with things like Leyline of Sanctity to just outright stop stuff like that. We have Hexproof that can't target us. Ashiok can do significant damage against combo decks that need to search for things. It shuts that down. Also, the milling effect can really add up when they don't have creatures to pressure you. You can mill a ridiculous amount of cards if this goes unchecked. Also, things like Mesmeric Orb and just the other mill cards can incidentally kind of just cause a lot of havoc to these combo decks. Some of them that are running maybe 1 or 2 copies of an important win condition, and sometimes that card just gets milled and their deck gets incidentally hosed by just cards that you're naturally running. So combo decks can be a decent matchup. Obviously in best of 3 situations this can get more complicated and tricky. It's never as straightforward as it seems because we don't know what they're running. Like I said, some of these Jund Trap Finder combo decks can be very tricky because they could have Back to Nature, sweep all of your enchantments. They're gonna undoubtedly bring in more hate if they don't already have a lot of enchantment removal and stuff. Obviously 9 Lives has hexproof, so it's a little bit of built-in defense and resistance to stuff like that, but they're going to be able to target your solemnities and stuff. So it's kind of like facing a control deck. We still want to mill them really quickly, and that's really our kind of like a best offense is a best defense kind of situation. So against combo, not going to look into usually bring in a lot. Occasionally there might be combo decks that aren't relying on their graveyard at all. So we can cherry pick some of these cards if we identify that they're not going to be very useful to us, like Rest in Peace could come out. We could just get in maybe a Maddening Cacophony for more mill, maybe a Rune Crab, try to sneak in there early for more progressive milling. Also, Pull of the Mist Moon, Temporary Lockdown against combo decks can just be too slow and irrelevant. You could cherry pick these out for some more mill as well. Just try to mill them as fast as possible. Hopefully you get a big, you can mulligan to a really important card like Leyline of Sanctity, and hopefully you can mill your opponent extremely fast or disrupt them just enough before they can, find the cards to get rid of what you're doing. Don't sweat it out too much because, like, obviously they're going to bring in stuff to kill your stuff, but that's going to dilute their combo as well. So their combo is going to become less consistent and reliable when they start to dilute their deck of the combo pieces to make room for more hate cards. So just always keep in mind, like, the name of the game, the best, if all else fails, is you want to mill them as fast as possible to just win. And these defensive hate type cards can help us survive, hopefully some quick combo kills long enough so that we can mill them and win. But that's the general strategy for these types of decks. Let me know what you think, of course, in the comments. If I've missed any really important cards, let me know what your experience has been in best of 3. If you've tried this deck in best of 3, it can be really wild. But I think this plan, it makes a lot of sense to me. You're boarding out. This is such a polarizing deck that we have some very obvious things that we can take out, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And certainly some cards that can enhance matchups. So that's the general strategy, like I was saying, against these 3 types of decks: combo, control, and aggro. It's been working out for me pretty well so far. That being said, I don't have a huge sample size of best of 3s, as I tend to grind best of 1 a lot. But this has been working for me in various events in best of 3. I've kind of enjoyed the strategy. But again, let me know what you think. If you're not already subscribed, subscribe, like. Very much appreciate all that YouTube nonsense. And definitely stay tuned for the next video because I've just gotten back into Top 100 Mythic this season. What is it, January 7th or something like that right now. And I've got one of the most powerful, maybe the most powerful configurations of an old favorite deck of mine that I haven't seen anyone else play. And it's using various new cards from some of the new sets. So definitely subscribe, like, and check out that next video that I'll be uploading here today in a little while. So thanks for watching, guys. As always, good luck on the ladder and peace.